Okay. Hello, everyone again. So today we have another cloud demo session. Today we have Ben Batschelet with us, who is our software engineer on the cloud team. So for some background, Ben initially was integrating PWA for Magento Cloud, and essentially he was one of the main contributors to do the integration for cloud. So today he wants to share with you a bit more information about how this works and how to do that right. So Ben, feel free to start when you are ready.
Thanks, Yev. Um, as Evgeny said, my name is Ben Batchelet. I'm a software engineer here at Adobe, working on the Magento Cloud team. And I want to talk about how to deploy PWA Studio and in particular upward onto Magento Cloud. So first, some just general background information. PWA Studio is our Magento's tools for developing progressive web applications for Magento. It's written in React, so it's a collection of components that you can kind of mix and match however you need. And then Venia is our reference implementation of that front end. So Venia is to PWA Studio as Luma is to Magento, right? So it's the same kind of idea. Upward, an Upward server acts as a router and a proxy between your Venia front end and your Magento back end. So Upward itself is actually just a specification. It lays out the schema for a YAML-based configuration file, and then the Upward server reads that YAML file and then defines certain behaviors, whether that's serving static files or doing templating or GraphQL queries, just kind of a combination of different services that the Upward server offers. And our original implementation of Upward was written in JavaScript as a Node.js service, but when we wanted to move on to Magento Cloud, that became an issue because currently there is no supported way of deploying a Node.js service on Magento Cloud. So we went back to that spec and wrote a second implementation in PHP, and that is Upward PHP. Upward PHP is not dependent on Magento directly. So it uses Zend or Laminas as some of its request modeling, but it does not depend on Magento directly. So you can actually deploy Upward PHP on any PHP server anywhere without Magento if you really wanted to. There is also the Upward connector, and that is a Magento 2 module. So the Upward connector wraps Upward PHP and injects it into Magento's own front controller stack and lets Upward PHP manage responses for Venia. And so that's our integration point between the two. So let's talk about how do you deploy a Venia storefront and Upward to cloud. I'm going to kind of operate under the assumption that you've got a basic vanilla Magento Cloud project already set up and cloned down locally, and that you've got a Venia storefront project somewhere else on your system. So we need to make a handful of changes to that Magento Cloud project. First and foremost, we need to require the Magento Upward connector, and this is what will inject Upward into our request, as I said. You do not need to require Upward PHP directly because it's a dependency of the Upward connector. So you just have that one composer requirement. Now, we need to include our PWA assets along with our project, and so we're going to store them in a PWA directory, which means we need to update our git ignore in order to include that, right? So we need to include both the PWA directory and the templates directory and all of its contents. For testing and development, we have some sample data that is really useful. To my knowledge, that hasn't been deployed anywhere to any Composer package repositories. So in order to add that sample data, you need to add the Git-based repositories to your Composer JSON. So here they are on the screen. In addition, obviously, if they're in the repository section, you also need to add the packages themselves to the dependencies section in your Composer JSON. because these are for testing and development and early development process, using the master branch is generally fine. You wouldn't really want to do this in your production branch, but that's okay. Now, there's a handful of environment variables that are used for configuring upward. Some of these can change slightly depending on which environment you're on, but some of them are constant. So I put them all in my Magento app YAML just for ease of demonstration, but depending on your environment and your use case, you may want to actually configure some of these in the project UI rather than the app YAML. So first and foremost, the upward connector needs to know where your upward YAML file is. It needs to be able to tell upward PHP where to find it. The upward connector uses Magento's standard configuration store. So you can use this syntax here, config default web upward path, in order to configure that from the environment variables without having to mess with the admin UI or do anything with the command line. So on your starter environments, this is going to be constant across all your environments. It's going to be on your starter projects. So app PWA upward YAML. On a pro-based project, this is going to vary on your production and your staging branches. So this is one that you may want to configure through the UI. Similarly, your Magento backend URL needs to be configured. Obviously, this is going to vary depending on which environment you're in. You can kind of get away with using one backend for all of your integration environments. That's sort of okay, but again, you probably want to change that depending on which environment you're working with. And then your Braintree token, obviously for your production or your master branch, you should have your production value there. For your test and development branches, you can use the sandbox token as I have. These last three are basically constant across all your environments, right? Your Node env, your Magento backend edition, and then image optimizing origin, we set that to backend, and that will utilize Fastly in order to do your image optimization in a really efficient manner. One last kind of optional piece, but it's worth being aware of and looking at. Because all of our front-end assets are coming from Venia and are being generated through that, we don't necessarily need to do static content deployment. And so that can cut down on some of our build prop time and some of our deployment downtime, depending on how we are set up. So you can use your Magento env YAML to skip static content deployment. The only kind of catch there is if you have a non-Venia storefront or your admin panel. Those both need to have their own static content generated. So I will generally use SCD on demand in order to generate those assets if I need them when I go to the admin panel. If you want a little bit more control over this, I would encourage you to look at the SCD matrix variable. And there you might be able to configure just the specific front ends or back ends that you need to generate your static content for and not have to spend the entire time developing all of the static content. So we're going to generate all of our Venia assets on our local system, copy them over into our PWA directory, and then deploy that. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So here in my editor, I have my Venia project. This is basically just a vanilla Venia project. I just generated this using PWA build pack, create project. I haven't done any other customizations or changes here, but as you go through and develop your PWA front end, you would make your changes, modify them, and then here in my shell, we would go ahead and do yarn run build. And that's going to compile all of my front end assets. My JavaScript can compress everything down and complain about my Braintree token because I'm using a development value, but that's fine. While that's building, let's take a look at my Magento Cloud project and kind of look at the changes that I did there that we talked about. So first and foremost, you can see here my git ignore. I have the PWA directory and the templates directory added in. In Composer.json, you can see the Venia sample data added into my repositories, as well as here in the require section. So that gets installed along with all my other dependencies. And then, as I said, I have the Magento module upward connector included in my dependencies, but I do not have upward PHP included. because that's already a dependency of the upward connector, so it just gets bundled in along with it. We take a look here at my app YAML. Down at the bottom, you can see those environment variables. As I said, I'm just going to put them in here for our demo purposes. Some of these you may want to configure through the project UI. Some you can leave in here, but here's where they would all go in there. And then lastly, env YAML. As I said, skipping static content deployment saves you some time on your deploy and downtime process. So my assets have all been built here in my Venia project. So deploying them in this case is just a matter of taking them from my Venia project, moving them into my PWA directory, and then switching back here to the command line. I'll go ahead and add the PWA directory, commit my changes, and then I would push this up to the cloud. Cloud would build all one of their PHP stuff and deploy it. I'm not going to make you sit here and watch that process because it's pretty tedious. So the end result, though, is we get our Venia front end. You can see this is running on my Magento Cloud site. It's an integration branch. But even still, it is very responsive because progressive web apps utilize a lot of very good caching and a lot of offline storage. So these all respond very, very quickly overall. Now, throughout this process, some of y'all may have noticed kind of a drawback, and that is that there is a very manual step involved here, right? As I'm making changes to my Venia front end, I have to manually compile them, manually take them from one project, copy them into another, and then deploy that project. And manual steps are always kind of the death of any kind of good throughput on software development. So the question is, how can we build all of this on the cloud? And the good news is we can. The bad news is the way that I've solved this for now is using a absolutely everybody's favorite technology, Git submodules. You might be able to, using a private NPM repository, push all of your Venia assets up to there and add them into your package.json. But that's kind of outside the scope of what I was going to cover today. So I have my Venia project stored in my personal GitHub, and then I'm using a submodule on my Magento Cloud project to include that submodule with everything else, and that gets pulled down with everything. So let's talk about kind of the changes you need to make in order to kind of follow this process on your Magento Cloud project. First, we need some NPM dependencies to be installed globally. So you can add this to your Magento app YAML. We need to include rimraf, webpack, and yarn so that they get installed along with all of our other PHP dependencies. We also need a newer version of Node than is currently installed on our Magento Cloud sites. So we need to install NVM, and then using NVM, install a newer version of Node on our build hook. And then after that step, you can see here our one-liner to install all the PWA dependencies and build that project. So cd into the PWA directory, install all of its dependencies, including its development dependencies, and then run the build process. We need to make one slight change to our environment variables, right? Because we are compiling those assets on the cloud and they get put into the dist directory. We just need to update our path to be under the dist directory. So let me switch back to my editor and I'll kind of walk you through what that looks like. I'm changing branches here. So you can see I tweaked my gitignore file slightly because I'm using a submodule. I can just include the PWA directory. I don't need to worry about including all of its other files within it. It's a little bit simpler to manage. Nothing's changed in my composer.json, same dependencies, same repositories. My Magento app YAML, you can see I've tweaked the environment variable here for the upward YAML file. At the top, I have my node dependencies being installed. And then if I scroll down here a little bit, you can see in the build hook, here's where I'm installing NVM and using NVM to install a newer version of Node. And then here's my one-liner in order to install all of my PWA dependencies and build that project. env.yaml has no changes, and then here you can see the Git submodules configuration. So in this setup, my build process would be making my changes in my Venia project, committing them to my project and pushing them up to my GitHub, and then coming to my Magento Cloud project, updating that submodule, committing the changes to that submodule, and pushing that up to Magento Cloud. It's a much simpler process, no more manual steps, much easier to manage. So I wanted to leave y'all here at the end with a handful of additional resources and some documentation on what we've talked about. I will, of course, send out these slides after the presentation's over. First and foremost, we have the high-level kind of product documentation on PWA Studio. All of PWA Studio's documentation can be found at this URL. In particular, I would highlight the upward configuration documentation as well as our Cloud Deploy tutorial. This process that I laid out here is slightly tweaked from that tutorial, but a lot of the same concepts are included. And then all the repositories for this software is, of course, open source. So all of PWA Studio's code is on that repository. It's a giant monorepo, so in addition to the Venia build pack, it also includes the upward specification as well as the upward.js reference implementation. And then here, the upward PHP implementation is under the Magento Research Organization. So if you want to look at the upward PHP code, I encourage you to take a look at that repository. So thank you so much for y'all's time. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hey, Ben. This is Manish from Quora. Thank you so much for this presentation. This is really helpful.
Great.
A couple of questions. During that step when you mentioned enabling skip content creation, you mentioned that we don't do it if we have default Luma theme. My question is it possible to have Luma as well as PWA frontend on cloud?
That's a frequent question, and I'm not entirely certain what the total support of that is at the moment. I know that's something that some of the folks on the PWA team were working on in order to have both a Luma-based front end as well as front end store, as well as a Venia-based store. So you might want to ask that in the PWA channel on our community engineering Slack. I don't know the answer off the top of my head at the moment.
Yeah, thanks for that. And one more question about multi-site. I mean, with this architecture, have you deployed multi-site website, or do you have any thoughts on how we should do that?
That would be doing a multi-site setup like that would be how you could solve that Luma versus PWA Studio front end. But again, I don't personally have any experience doing any multi-site work with Venia, so I can't speak to that directly. But
yeah, I mean, multi-site means, let's say if we have US and UK site, different PWA sites, do you have any ideas on how we can host that in Magento Cloud? I mean, what we are doing, I will tell you, is we have created 2 subfolders inside that PWA folder, and we also had to make some modifications to upward because that upward path has to switch based on store. So that's what we are doing. I just wanted to check with you if you validate that approach or if you have any other solution for that.
I don't have any off the top of my head. I think actually I might have gotten roped in on a support ticket for your project. So I think I've seen what you're working with. And so, yeah, I'm vaguely familiar with what you're talking about. But I don't think I have any better solutions at the top of my head at this time.
Yeah, I mean, it's working well, but I mean, if you have anything better or if you think that there are problems with that, just let us know.
Yeah, thank you. I will.
Okay, thanks, Ben.
Hey Ben, so this is Chris from India. So, what you will, is there a possibility we can host some other PWAs in node-based applications there, other than PWA Studio? Something like Vue Storefront or custom PWA Studio. Yeah.
Sure. I don't have any firsthand experience using Vue Storefront or any other progressive web applications, so it's not something that I can really speak to personally. Obviously, we're focused primarily on our first-party support, but I'm sure that somebody out there has some documentation on doing Vue storefront. I don't know about the specifics of doing it on cloud, so I can't, unfortunately, really answer those questions. So I'm sorry, I don't have the experience to know for certain.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There was a question regarding the documentation. James answered in the chat. So I think probably we are good with documentation.
Yeah, the PWA Studio has some excellent documentation on that URL. I saw James shared that. Most of this presentation is based off of that. I tweaked some things just for especially that Git submodule step, but in general, these steps are all documented there and can be followed along. And as I said, I will make sure that these slides go out after the presentation's over.
Thank you, Ben. So we have recorded this presentation and we will publish on our YouTube Cloud Community Engineering channel. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask into the Cloud channel. And just a call if you have any topic to present, some presentation, some experience. Please feel free to reach to me, this Oleg or Yev, and we will give you a free spot so you can present for the broader cloud audience. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah. Thanks again for all y'all's time. It was a lot of fun.
Have a good day. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Ben.